In the depths of the American wilderness, where shadows dance between ancient trees and secrets lie buried beneath fallen leaves, one man's extraordinary gift would become both his greatest strength and his most terrible burden. This is the story of how a single footprint in the mud changed the fate of dozens of souls seeking freedom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the Arizona territory like a shroud, wrapping around the towering pines and ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of human struggle. In 1858, this was a land where survival meant reading the language written in bent grass, disturbed soil, and the subtle signs that most men would never notice. Joseph Crow Feather knelt beside a stream, his weathered fingers tracing the edge of a barely visible impression in the soft earth. At 62, his back bore the weight of decades spent tracking everything from lost cattle to dangerous outlaws, but his eyes remained as sharp as the day he'd first learned to read the earth's secrets from his grandfather. The old Apache ways flowed through his veins, like the water in the stream before him. His grandfather, Standing Bear, had been a legendary tracker among their people, capable of following a deer's trail across solid rock or finding a hidden spring in the driest desert. "The earth speaks to those who know how to listen," Standing Bear had told him as a boy. "Every step leaves a story. Every disturbance tells a tale. Learn to read these stories, and you will never be lost." Those lessons had served Joseph well throughout his life. After the Apache Wars had scattered his people and forced them onto reservations, his tracking skills had become his salvation. The white settlers who had once feared him now paid him handsomely for his abilities. He could find lost children in the vast wilderness, track down stolen livestock, and locate dangerous animals that threatened frontier communities. But success had come with a price. Joseph lived between two worlds, trusted by neither, belonging fully to none. The Apache viewed him with suspicion for working with their former enemies. The whites saw him as useful, but never forgot what he was, a tame Indian who could be discarded when his services were no longer needed. "Another deer trail," he murmured to himself, noting the delicate hoofprints that led toward the water. But something else caught his attention, a disturbance in the natural pattern, so subtle that even experienced trackers would have missed it. The grass was bent at an unusual angle, and there was a faint depression in the mud that didn't match the deer's gait. Joseph had learned long ago to trust his instincts. In his world, the difference between noticing and missing a detail could mean the difference between life and death. He studied the area more carefully, noting how the morning dew had settled differently on the disturbed vegetation, how the soil had been compressed in a way that suggested something heavier than a deer had passed this way. The sound of approaching horses made him straighten. 3 men emerged from the tree line, their faces hard with the kind of determination that spelled trouble. Joseph recognized them immediately. Marcus Whitmore, owner of the largest plantation in the territory, flanked by his foreman Dutch Kellerman and the notorious slave hunter Silas Cray. Whitmore was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as one of the territory's wealthiest residents, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. His plantation, Whitmore Acres, sprawled across thousands of acres of prime farmland, worked by over 200 enslaved people who had been brought west as their owner sought to expand his empire. Dutch Kellerman, his foreman, was a different breed entirely. Short and stocky, with arms like tree trunks and a face scarred by years of violence, he was known throughout the territory as Whitmore's enforcer. It was said that Dutch had never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists or his whip, and the enslaved people on Whitmore's plantation lived in constant fear of his brutal discipline. But it was the third man who made Joseph's blood run cold. Silas Cray was perhaps the most feared slave hunter in the entire Southwest, a man who had made a fortune tracking down escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. Tall and lean, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through a person, Cray was known for his relentless pursuit of his quarry and his complete lack of mercy. It was said that he had never failed to bring back a runaway, dead or alive. "Crow Feather," Whitmore called out, dismounting with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to command. His expensive boots squelched in the mud as he approached. "We need your services." Joseph remained silent, his dark eyes studying the men. In his experience, when white men sought him out with such urgency, it rarely meant good news for anyone involved. He had learned to read people as carefully as he read tracks, and what he saw in these three faces told him that whatever they wanted, it would likely compromise his carefully maintained neutrality. 12 of my property ran off 3 nights ago, Whitmore continued, using the cold terminology that reduced human beings to mere possessions. They've vanished into these woods like smoke. Every tracker I've hired has come back empty-handed. Joseph's jaw tightened at the casual way Whitmore referred to human beings as property, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard rumors about conditions on Whitmore's plantation, whispers of brutal punishments, inadequate food and working conditions that killed the strong and broke the weak. If 12 people had risked everything to escape, their desperation must have been overwhelming. Dutch Kellerman spat into the dirt, his face twisted with frustration. Damned if they haven't just disappeared. No trail, no sign, nothing. It's like they sprouted wings and flew away. I've had my best men combing these woods for 3 days and they ain't found so much as a broken twig. Silas Cray, a lean man with cold blue eyes and scars crisscrossing his hands from years of handling chains and whips, stepped forward. His voice was soft, almost conversational, but there was something in his tone that made Joseph's skin crawl. That's where you come in, Apache. We've heard about your special talents. They say you can track a shadow across solid rock, that you can find sign where other men see nothing but empty ground. Joseph's reputation as a tracker was well-deserved, built over decades of successful hunts and rescues. But that reputation had also made him a target for men like these, who saw his skills as tools to be used for their own purposes. He had always been careful about the jobs he accepted, turning down work that conflicted with his conscience. But he sensed that these men weren't going to give him a choice. I track animals, Joseph replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent navigating the dangerous waters between two cultures. Lost cattle, sometimes lost people who want to be found. The emphasis on the last phrase was subtle but unmistakable. Joseph had never hunted human beings who were seeking freedom, and he had no intention of starting now. But even as he spoke, he could see from the expressions on the 3 men's faces that his refusal would not be accepted. These people need to be found, Whitmore said, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. His face was flushed with anger and something else, a kind of desperate greed that spoke of financial pressures Joseph could only guess at. They're valuable property, and I won't stand for theft. Those 12 slaves represent an investment of over $15,000. I can't afford to lose them. They're not property, Joseph replied quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. They're human beings. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Whitmore's face flushed red, and his hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. For a moment, Joseph thought the man might actually draw his weapon, and he tensed, ready to defend himself if necessary. "Now you listen here, you red-skinned," Whitmore began, his voice rising with rage. "Mr. Whitmore," Cray interrupted smoothly, placing a restraining hand on the plantation owner's arm. His voice remained calm, but his eyes never left Joseph's face. "Let me handle this." He turned to Joseph with a smile that never reached his eyes, an expression that reminded the tracker of a snake preparing to strike. "You see, Crowfeather, this isn't really a request. It's more of a business proposition." Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had dealt with men like Cray before, predators who used threats and intimidation to get what they wanted. But there was something different about this man, something that suggested he would follow through on any threat he made. "Your family," Cray continued conversationally, pulling a small notebook from his vest pocket and flipping through its pages. "Lives on that nice piece of land about 5 miles north of here, don't they? Your daughter Sarah, her husband Tom Martinez, and those 3 beautiful grandchildren of yours. Little Mary must be, what, 7 now, and the twins, they're barely walking." The blood drained from Joseph's face as he realized how thoroughly these men had researched his life. They knew about his family, knew where they lived, knew details that could only have been gathered through careful surveillance. The threat was clear, even though it hadn't been explicitly stated. "I've made it my business to learn about you, Mr. Crowfeather," Cray continued, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You're a man with a reputation for honor, for doing what's right, but you're also a man with people you care about, people who depend on you for their safety and security." Joseph's hands clenched into fists, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "What do you want?" "Simple," Whitmore said, regaining his composure but still radiating barely controlled anger. "Find my runaway slaves. Bring them back. Do this, and your family continues to live peacefully on their land. Refuse." He shrugged eloquently, the gesture somehow more threatening than any explicit threat could have been. "The territorial government has been very interested in reviewing land grants lately," Cray added, consulting his notebook again. "Especially those given to undesirable elements. Amazing how quickly paperwork can disappear, how easily claims can be disputed. Your family's farm was granted to you after your service as a scout for the U.S. Army, wasn't it? Such grants can be revoked if questions arise about the recipient's loyalty or usefulness." Joseph understood perfectly. His family's small farm, granted to them after his service as a scout for the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War, could be taken away with a few strokes of a pen. In 1858, Native Americans had few rights that white men were bound to respect, and even fewer legal protections. If these men decided to move against his family, there would be little he could do to stop them through legal channels. The farm represented everything his family had worked for since the end of the Apache Wars. His daughter Sarah had married Tom Martinez, a good man who treated her with respect and love. Together they had built a life on that land, raising cattle and growing crops that fed not only their own family, but supplied the nearby town of Cedar Ridge. His grandchildren were growing up free, learning to read and write, with opportunities that Joseph himself had never had. "How long do I have?" he asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "1 week," Whitmore replied, his satisfaction evident in his voice. "Find them, and bring them back alive. I need them in working condition. Dead slaves are worthless to me." Cray closed his notebook and tucked it back into his vest. "We'll be staying at the Territorial Hotel in Cedar Ridge. You can find us there when you have information to report. And Mr. Crowfeather?" He paused, his cold eyes boring into Joseph's. "Don't even think about running. We have people watching your family. Any attempt to warn them or move them to safety will be seen as a breach of our agreement." As the 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, Joseph stood alone by the stream, watching their dust settle on the morning air. The weight of the impossible choice pressed down on him like a physical burden. Save his family by condemning others to a life of bondage, or protect strangers and watch his own blood suffer the consequences. He knelt again by the water's edge, not to read tracks this time, but to see his own reflection staring back at him. The face that looked up from the surface was that of a man caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, trusted by few, and now forced to choose between 2 different kinds of betrayal. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere in that green maze, 12 human beings were fighting for their freedom, probably terrified, hungry, and desperate. And somewhere else, his family was going about their daily lives, unaware that their fate now hung in the balance. Joseph thought about his granddaughter Mary, who would run to greet him whenever he visited, her small face lighting up with joy as she demanded stories of his tracking adventures. He thought about the twins, David and Daniel, who were just learning to walk and would toddle toward him with squeals of delight whenever he appeared. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who had inherited his strong will and moral compass, and who would be devastated if she knew the choice he now faced. Joseph Crowfeather rose slowly, his decision made. He would track the runaways, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. But perhaps in the tracking he might find a way to serve both justice and survival. Perhaps there was a path through this moral wilderness that would allow him to protect both his family and the people seeking freedom. The hunt was about to begin, but Joseph was no longer certain who was the hunter and who was the prey. 3 days into his search, Joseph had covered nearly 40 square miles of dense forest, following false trails and dead ends that would have discouraged any ordinary tracker. But Joseph Crow-Feather was far from ordinary, and the more he searched, the more convinced he became that he was dealing with someone equally exceptional. The runaways had left virtually no trace of their passage. No broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth, no carelessly discarded items. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the wilderness. But Joseph knew better. In his 62 years, he had learned that everything left a mark. The question was whether you knew how to read it. The forest itself seemed to be conspiring to hide the fugitive's trail. The recent rains had washed away most surface signs, and the thick canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into a dim, green twilight that made detailed observation difficult. Joseph found himself relying more and more on the subtle skills his grandfather had taught him, the ability to sense disturbances in the natural order that went beyond mere visual clues. He had started his search at the point where the runaways had last been seen, the eastern boundary of Whitmore's plantation, where a wooden fence marked the edge of the property. From there, the logical escape route would have led north toward the Colorado River or west toward the Mexican border, but Joseph had found no sign of passage in either direction. Instead, he had discovered something far more intriguing, a complete absence of sign. The area around the plantation's eastern boundary was too clean, too undisturbed. It was as if someone had deliberately erased all traces of human passage, sweeping away footprints and replacing disturbed vegetation with such skill that only the most experienced tracker would notice the deception. This told Joseph several important things about his quarry. First, they were being led by someone with extensive knowledge of tracking and counter-tracking techniques. Second, they had taken time to carefully conceal their escape route, which suggested they weren't simply running in panic, but following a well-thought-out plan. Third, and most importantly, they had help, someone who knew the territory intimately and understood how to move through it without leaving sign. Joseph's respect for his unknown adversary grew with each passing hour. Whoever was leading these people possessed skills that rivaled his own, and that was a sobering thought. In all his years of tracking, he had rarely encountered someone capable of completely erasing their trail. It suggested military training, or perhaps someone who had learned the hard way how to stay ahead of pursuers. On the second day of his search, Joseph had expanded his search pattern, moving in ever-widening circles around the plantation. He checked every water source, every game trail, every natural shelter, where a group of 12 people might have rested. He found deer sign, bear tracks, the remains of a wolf kill, and the scattered bones of small animals, but nothing that indicated human passage. It was frustrating work, made more difficult by the knowledge of what failure would mean for his family. Each night, as he made camp in the wilderness, Joseph found himself thinking about Sarah and the children, wondering if they were safe, if Cray's men were watching them as promised. The uncertainty gnawed at him like a physical pain, but Joseph was nothing if not persistent. On the third day, he changed his approach entirely. Instead of looking for where the runaways had gone, he began looking for where they hadn't gone. He systematically eliminated possible routes, marking them off in his mind like a chess player considering moves on a board. The breakthrough came when he realized that his quarry was thinking like he would think, like a tracker trying to avoid other trackers. They weren't following the obvious routes because they knew those routes would be searched first. Instead, they were doing something far more clever. They were hiding in plain sight. On the fourth morning, he found himself at Willow Creek, a meandering waterway that cut through the heart of the forest. The creek was perhaps 20 feet wide at this point, with clear water running over smooth stones and fallen logs, creating natural bridges. Joseph had been here twice before during his search, but something made him return. This time he approached the creek differently. Instead of looking for obvious signs of passage, he studied the area with the eyes of someone trying to hide a trail. He noted how the water would wash away footprints, how the rocky banks would show no impressions, how the overhanging vegetation would conceal movement from casual observation. He stood on the bank, letting his eyes unfocus slightly, a technique his grandfather had taught him decades ago. "Don't look for what should be there," the old man had said. "Look for what shouldn't be there. The forest has its own rhythm, its own patterns. Learn to recognize when something disrupts that rhythm, no matter how small." That's when he saw it. A single stone, no larger than his fist, sitting on a fallen log that spanned the creek. The stone was perfectly ordinary. grey granite worn smooth by countless years of water and weather. But it was positioned exactly in the center of the log, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Joseph's pulse quickened. In all his years of tracking, he had learned to pay attention to anything that seemed out of place, no matter how insignificant it might appear. Natural processes rarely created perfect symmetry or precise placement. When he found such things in the wilderness, it usually meant human intervention. He waded into the creek, the cold water soaking through his moccasins and sending a chill up his legs. The current was stronger than it appeared from the bank, and he had to brace himself against the fallen log to maintain his balance. He examined the stone without touching it, noting how it caught the morning light, how it had been positioned to be visible from both upstream and downstream. Then he looked down into the water beneath the log. There, reflected in the still pool created by the natural dam, he saw what he had been looking for. The reflection showed not just the stone, but the subtle disturbance in the creek bed beneath it, a pattern of displaced pebbles that formed an arrow pointing upstream. Someone had used the stone as a marker, knowing that only someone looking for the reflection would see the true message. "Clever," Joseph murmured, feeling a grudging admiration for whoever had devised this system. Very clever indeed. The technique was brilliant in its simplicity. A casual observer would see nothing more than a stone on a log if they noticed it at all. But someone who knew to look for reflections would find a clear directional indicator. It was a method of communication that could be used to guide followers while remaining completely invisible to pursuers. Joseph began to understand the true scope of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just a group of desperate runaways stumbling through the wilderness. This was an organized operation, with sophisticated methods of communication and navigation. Someone had spent considerable time and effort developing this system, which suggested that helping escaped slaves was not a one-time occurrence, but an ongoing activity. He followed the creek upstream, now knowing what to look for. Every few hundred yards he found another marker, sometimes a stone, sometimes a piece of bark positioned just so, sometimes a branch bent at an unnatural angle. Each marker was designed to cast a reflection that revealed the next clue, creating a chain of invisible signposts that could guide travelers through the wilderness. The trail led him deeper into the forest, through terrain so rugged that few white men would have attempted to traverse it. The creek wound between towering cliffs and through narrow gorges where the sun barely penetrated the canopy. It was country that Joseph knew well from his youth, when his people had used these hidden valleys as hunting grounds and sacred sites. Whoever was leading this group knew the land intimately and possessed skills that rivaled Joseph's own. They understood not just how to move through difficult terrain, but how to use the landscape itself as a tool for concealment and communication. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of experience, from someone who had learned to think like both hunter and hunted. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, Joseph heard something that made him freeze. The sound of children's laughter quickly hushed. The sound was faint, carried on the wind for just a moment before disappearing, but it was unmistakably human. He was close. Moving with the silent grace that had made him legendary among both his own people and the white settlers, Joseph crept through the underbrush toward the sound. He used every technique his grandfather had taught him, placing his feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs, moving slowly to prevent the rustling of leaves, breathing quietly through his nose to avoid making any sound that might carry. The forest around him was alive with the subtle sounds of wildlife, the chittering of squirrels, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Joseph used these natural sounds as cover, timing his movements to coincide with louder noises that would mask any sound he might make. What he found took his breath away. Hidden in a natural depression surrounded by towering trees and thick vegetation was a small village. Not the crude shelters he had expected, but carefully constructed cabins built from local materials and designed to blend seamlessly with the forest. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources, and their roof lines were broken up with branches and vegetation that made them nearly invisible from above. Smoke from cooking fires was dispersed through ingenious systems of hollow logs that carried it far from its source before releasing it, making detection nearly impossible. The entire settlement had been designed by someone who understood both engineering and camouflage, someone who had thought carefully about every aspect of concealment and survival. Joseph counted at least 20 people moving about the settlement, men, women, and children of all ages. The 12 runaways from Whitmore's plantation were there, but they had clearly joined a much larger community of escaped slaves who had been living in the wilderness for months, perhaps years. The organization of the settlement impressed him almost as much as its concealment. Gardens had been planted in clearings where the canopy allowed sufficient sunlight, but they were scattered and camouflaged to avoid detection from above. Water was drawn from a natural spring that had been carefully developed to provide a reliable supply without creating obvious signs of human activity. Most impressive of all was the sense of community that pervaded the settlement. Joseph watched as people worked together on various tasks, some tending gardens, others preparing food, still others working on construction projects or maintaining equipment. There was no overseer with a whip, no atmosphere of fear and oppression. Instead, he saw people working together by choice, contributing their skills and labor to a common cause. As he watched, a tall man emerged from the largest cabin. Joseph estimated him to be in his 40s, with the bearing of a natural leader, and scars on his back that spoke of brutal treatment. This had to be the one responsible for the ingenious tracking system, a man who had learned to think like a hunter in order to stay ahead of the hunters. The man's name, Joseph would later learn, was Samuel Freeman, a name he had chosen for himself the day he escaped from a Georgia plantation 5 years earlier. Samuel had been a blacksmith before his enslavement, and his skills with metal had made him valuable enough to receive slightly better treatment than field hands. But that treatment had also given him access to tools and knowledge that he had used to plan not just his own escape, but the liberation of dozens of others. Joseph watched as Samuel organized the daily activities of the settlement with quiet efficiency. Children attended makeshift schools where older residents taught them to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to them in bondage. Adults worked together to maintain their homes, tend small gardens hidden beneath the forest canopy, and craft the tools they needed for survival. It was, Joseph realized, a functioning community built on principles of mutual aid and shared responsibility. These people had not simply run away from slavery. They had created an alternative to it, a place where human dignity could flourish even in the wilderness. But as he observed this remarkable achievement, Joseph felt the weight of his impossible situation pressing down on him like a physical force. In less than 3 days, he would have to return to Whitmore with information about the runaways' location. If he failed to do so, his own family would pay the price. As if summoned by his thoughts, a small hand tugged at his memory. His granddaughter Mary, just 7 years old, with her bright smile and endless questions about the world. The twins, barely 2, who squealed with delight whenever he visited and told them stories of his tracking adventures. How could he choose between the freedom of these strangers and the safety of his own blood? As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the hidden village, Joseph Crowfeather faced the most difficult decision of his life. He had found what he was looking for, but in doing so, he had discovered something he never expected. A glimpse of what freedom could look like when people were willing to fight for it together. The question now was what he would do with that knowledge. That night, Joseph made camp a mile away from the hidden village, but sleep eluded him. He lay on his bedroll staring up at the stars through the forest canopy, his mind churning with the magnitude of his discovery and the impossible choice that lay before him. He had found them. After 4 days of tracking, he had located not just the 12 runaways from Whitmore's plantation, but an entire community of escaped slaves who had built something remarkable in the wilderness. The knowledge burned in his chest like a coal, demanding action but offering no clear path forward. The night sounds of the forest surrounded him, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. These were familiar sounds that had comforted him throughout his life, but tonight they seemed to mock his predicament. Even the animals were free to come and go as they pleased, while human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Joseph's thoughts turned to his own past, to the stories his grandfather had told him about the time before the white men came. when his people had roamed freely across the vast territories of the Southwest. Standing Bear had spoken of a time when a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by his courage, his wisdom, and his loyalty to his people. A man who betrays his principles for safety, his grandfather had once told him, is like a tree that bends so far in the wind that it breaks. Better to stand firm and face the storm than to compromise your soul for temporary shelter. But Standing Bear had never faced a choice like this. He had never been forced to choose between the freedom of strangers and the safety of his own family. The old Apache ways provided guidance for many situations, but they offered no clear answer to Joseph's current dilemma. As dawn broke, Joseph made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of returning immediately to report his findings, he would observe the village for one more day. He told himself it was to gather more complete information, but in truth he was hoping to find some solution to his dilemma, some way to protect both his family and the people in the hidden settlement. The morning mist clung to the trees as Joseph positioned himself in a new observation point, a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the village while keeping him concealed. From this vantage point, he could see the entire settlement and watch the daily routines of its inhabitants. He spent the morning watching the village from various concealed positions, marveling at the ingenuity and organization he witnessed. The residents had created an elaborate system of lookouts and signals that would give them advance warning of any approaching danger. Sentries were posted at strategic points around the perimeter, and Joseph noticed that they communicated through a series of bird calls that would sound natural to any casual listener. The lookouts themselves were impressive, men and women who moved through the forest with a skill that rivaled his own. They had clearly been trained by someone who understood the art of concealment and surveillance, and their vigilance was constant but unobtrusive. Joseph realized that he had probably been observed from the moment he entered the area, and that his presence was known even if his intentions were not yet clear. They had dug wells that tapped into underground springs, ensuring a reliable water supply that couldn't be easily detected from the surface. The wells were cleverly disguised as natural depressions, and the water was drawn up through a system of pulleys and ropes that could be quickly hidden if necessary. Their gardens were scattered throughout the forest in small hidden plots that would be nearly impossible to spot from above. Each plot was carefully tended and designed to look like natural clearings, with vegetables and herbs growing among wild plants in patterns that mimicked nature's own randomness. Most impressive of all was their leader, Samuel Freeman. Joseph watched as the man moved through the settlement, settling disputes with quiet wisdom, organizing work details with military precision, and somehow maintaining morale despite the constant threat of discovery and recapture. Samuel's leadership style was unlike anything Joseph had observed among white communities. There was no harsh discipline, no arbitrary exercise of authority. Instead, decisions seemed to be made through discussion and consensus, with Samuel serving more as a facilitator than a dictator. It was a form of governance that reminded Joseph of the old Apache ways, where chiefs led through wisdom and example rather than force. It was during his observation that Joseph noticed something that changed everything: a young woman teaching a group of children to read, using a Bible as their textbook. The woman was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and gentle hands that guided small fingers across the pages, but it was her face that stopped Joseph's heart. She looked exactly like his daughter Sarah had at that age. The resemblance was so striking that Joseph had to blink several times to convince himself he wasn't seeing things. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw, the same way of tilting her head when concentrating. Even her gestures were similar, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she smiled encouragingly at a struggling student. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just abstract figures in his moral calculation. They were people with faces, with families, with hopes and dreams and fears just like his own. The young woman teaching the children could have been his daughter. The children themselves could have been his grandchildren. Joseph watched as the woman worked patiently with a boy who was struggling to sound out words. Her voice was gentle but firm, encouraging the child to keep trying even when he became frustrated. There was something in her manner that spoke of natural teaching ability, of someone who genuinely cared about the welfare of others. Around the makeshift classroom, other children played quietly, their laughter carefully muted but still present. Joseph saw a little girl about Mary's age helping a younger child with his letters, her small face serious with concentration. He saw twin boys, perhaps the same age as David and Daniel, playing with wooden toys that had been carved with obvious care and skill. How could he condemn them to return to bondage? How could he destroy this remarkable community that had managed to create something beautiful and free in the midst of a hostile world? But even as his conscience pulled him in one direction, the image of his actual family pulled him in another. His granddaughter Mary, who ran to greet him every time he visited, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she demanded stories of his adventures. The twins, who were just learning to walk and would toddle toward him with squeals of delight whenever he appeared. What would happen to them if he failed to return with information about the runaways? Whitmore and his associates had made their threats clear. His family would lose their land, their home, their livelihood. In the harsh realities of 1858 Arizona territory, that could mean death sentences for all of them. Joseph thought about his daughter Sarah, who had worked so hard to build a life with her husband Tom. They had started with nothing but determination and love, slowly building their farm into a successful operation that provided not only for their own family, but for the broader community. Sarah had inherited Joseph's strong will and moral compass, and she had used those qualities to create something meaningful and lasting. If they lost the farm, where would they go? What would they do? Tom was a skilled rancher, but jobs were scarce in the territory, especially for a Mexican man married to an Apache woman. The prejudices of the time would make it nearly impossible for them to start over elsewhere. And what about the children? Mary was just beginning her education, learning to read and write with the help of the traveling teacher, who visited their area once a month. The twins were at a crucial age when proper nutrition and medical care could mean the difference between healthy development and lifelong problems. As the day wore on, Joseph found himself drawn closer to the village, until he was crouched behind a fallen log, less than 50 yards from the nearest cabin. From this position he could hear conversations, could see the expressions on people's faces, could witness the small moments of joy and sorrow that made up their daily lives. He watched an elderly man carving a wooden toy for a small boy, his gnarled hands working with surprising skill and precision. The toy was a horse, complete with a flowing mane and tail, and the child's eyes lit up with delight as he received it. The old man's face creased with pleasure at the boy's reaction, and Joseph could see the love and pride in his expression. He saw a woman mending clothes with careful stitches, making old garments last as long as possible. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, and Joseph noticed that she was not just repairing the clothes, but improving them, adding decorative elements that transformed utilitarian garments into something beautiful. He observed teenagers helping with cooking and cleaning, their faces showing none of the sullen resentment he might have expected, but rather a sense of purpose and belonging. These young people understood that their survival depended on everyone contributing their share, and they approached their responsibilities with maturity beyond their years. This was a community in the truest sense of the word. These people had found something in the wilderness that many settlements with all the advantages of civilization never achieved: genuine cooperation, mutual respect, and shared commitment to something larger than individual survival. Joseph noticed how conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than force, how resources were shared according to need rather than ability to pay, how decisions were made with consideration for their impact on the entire community. It was a form of social organization that embodied the best aspects of human nature, proving that people could live together in harmony when freed from the corrupting influences of greed and power. As afternoon faded into evening, Joseph made another decision that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation for caution and careful planning. He stood up from his hiding place and walked directly toward the village. He was spotted immediately, of course. The lookouts were too well trained to miss a man of his size moving through the forest. Within seconds, he found himself surrounded by 6 men armed with hunting rifles, their faces grim, but not panicked. These people had clearly prepared for this moment, had drilled for the possibility of discovery. The men who surrounded him moved with military precision, positioning themselves to cover all possible escape routes while maintaining clear fields of fire. Joseph noted their discipline and coordination, recognizing the signs of training that went beyond simple hunting experience. Someone had taught these men to work as a unit, to respond to threats with organized efficiency. "Don't move," commanded a voice from behind him. "State your business." Joseph raised his hands slowly, showing that he carried no weapons. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening, designed to demonstrate that he posed no immediate danger. "My name is Joseph Crowfeather. I'm a tracker. I've been hired to find you." A murmur ran through the group of men surrounding him. One of them, a young man with a scar across his left cheek, stepped closer. His eyes were hard with suspicion, but Joseph could see intelligence there as well. "You're the Apache they say can track a ghost across solid rock." "I've been called that," Joseph admitted. The reputation was both a blessing and a curse. It brought him work, but it also made him a target for men like Whitmore and Cray. "Then you found us," said another voice, and Samuel Freeman emerged from the group. Up close the man was even more impressive, tall and broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. There was something in his bearing that commanded respect, a natural authority that came not from position but from character. Samuel's face bore the marks of his past, scars that spoke of brutal treatment, lines of worry that came from constant vigilance, but also a strength that had not been broken by years of bondage. Joseph could see why this man had become a leader, why others would follow him into the wilderness in search of freedom. "The question is," Samuel continued, his voice calm but watchful, "what do you intend to do about it?" Joseph looked around at the faces surrounding him. He saw fear there, but also determination. These people would fight if they had to, would die before they allowed themselves to be taken back to slavery. But he also saw something else, a willingness to listen, to hear what he had to say before they acted. It was that willingness to listen that gave Joseph hope. These were not desperate people acting out of panic, but thoughtful individuals who understood that violence should be a last resort. They were prepared to fight, but they preferred to find peaceful solutions when possible. "I don't know," Joseph said honestly. "That's why I'm here." Samuel studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching Joseph's face for signs of deception or hidden agenda. Then he nodded to his men. "Lower your weapons. If he meant to betray us, he wouldn't have walked into our camp alone." The logic was sound, and the men responded immediately to Samuel's command. Joseph noted their discipline and trust in their leader, recognizing the signs of a well-organized group that had learned to work together under pressure. Samuel turned back to Joseph. "You said you've been hired to find us. By whom?" "Marcus Whitmore, the plantation owner. 12 of his people joined you 3 nights ago." "His slaves, you mean?" Samuel corrected, his voice carrying a note of steel. "And yes, they did. They're free now, just like the rest of us. Whitmore wants them back. He's given me a week to find them." "And if you don't?" Joseph's voice was barely above a whisper. "My family will pay the price." Understanding dawned in Samuel's eyes, and his expression softened slightly. "Ah, so you're caught between 2 impossible choices. Betray us to save your family, or protect us and watch your loved ones suffer. That's about the size of it." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying Joseph's face with the intensity of a man who had learned to read character quickly and accurately. Then he made a gesture that surprised everyone present. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." Samuel led Joseph through the village, past the curious stares of residents who had never seen their hidden sanctuary discovered by an outsider. Children peered out from behind their parents, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Adults watched with careful attention, ready to act if the stranger proved to be a threat, but willing to trust their leader's judgment. Joseph noticed how the villagers positioned themselves as he passed, never blocking his path, but always maintaining clear lines of sight and quick access to weapons. It was the behavior of people who had learned to be constantly vigilant, who understood that their survival depended on their ability to respond quickly to danger. The village itself was even more impressive up close than it had been from a distance. The cabins were built with remarkable skill, using techniques that maximized both strength and camouflage. The walls were constructed from local timber fitted together with precision, that would have impressed any carpenter, and the roofs were designed to shed water efficiently while remaining invisible from above. Between the buildings, Joseph saw evidence of careful planning and organization. Pathways were laid out to minimize erosion and noise, with strategic placement of stepping stones and wooden planks that allowed for quiet movement, even in wet weather. Storage areas were cleverly concealed beneath false floors and hidden compartments that would be nearly impossible to detect without detailed knowledge of their location. They walked to the far edge of the settlement, where a small cemetery had been carved out of the forest floor. Simple wooden markers bore names and dates, telling the stories of those who had died in freedom rather than live in bondage. The graves were arranged in neat rows, each one carefully tended and marked with small tokens of remembrance, flowers, stones, personal items that spoke of lives lived and mourned. 17 graves, Samuel said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. 17 people who made it this far, but couldn't make it any further. Some died from injuries sustained during their escapes, wounds from dogs, gunshots from pursuing slave catchers, infections that went untreated because we couldn't risk seeking medical help from white doctors. Joseph read the markers, noting that several bore the names of children. One grave belonged to a girl named Lucy, who had died at the age of 8. Another marked the resting place of an infant who had lived only 3 days after his mother's arrival at the settlement. The sight of these small graves hit Joseph like a physical blow, reminding him of the human cost of the institution of slavery. Others died from diseases that went untreated because we couldn't risk seeking medical help, Samuel continued, his voice growing quieter with each word. Pneumonia, dysentery, infections that could have been cured with proper medicine and care. A few from simple exhaustion. Their bodies just gave out after years of abuse and the strain of the journey here. Samuel knelt beside one of the graves, his hand resting gently on the wooden marker. "This is Rebecca," he said. "She was my wife. We escaped together from a plantation in Georgia, traveled for 3 months to reach this place. She died 2 weeks after we arrived, from a fever that started during our journey. She never got to see what we built here, never got to experience the freedom she died for." The pain in Samuel's voice was raw and immediate, despite the passage of time. Joseph could see that the loss still haunted him, that the memory of his wife's death was a wound that had never fully healed. But he could also see something else in Samuel's expression, a determination to ensure that her sacrifice had meaning, that the community they had built together would continue to offer hope to others seeking freedom. "How long have you been building this place?" Joseph asked, his voice respectful of the sacred nature of the ground they stood on. 3 years, Samuel replied, rising slowly from beside his wife's grave. "I was the first, but others followed. Word spreads, you know, even among people who aren't supposed to be able to read or write. They hear about a place in the wilderness where a man can live free, where children can learn to read, where no one owns anyone else." They walked among the graves in silence for a few moments, each marker telling its own story of courage and sacrifice. Joseph noticed that some of the graves were marked only with initials or symbols, suggesting that some of the dead had chosen to take their real names with them to the grave, rather than risk exposing family members who might still be in bondage. "Every person buried here made a choice," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "They chose the possibility of freedom over the certainty of bondage, even knowing it might cost them their lives. They chose hope over safety, dignity over survival." Joseph understood the parallel Samuel was drawing. "And now you're asking me to make the same choice?" "No," Samuel replied, surprising him. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just showing you what we've built here, what we're trying to protect. The choice is yours to make." They returned to the center of the village, where the entire community had gathered. Joseph found himself standing before nearly 40 people, men, women, and children of all ages, all looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear. These were the faces of his dilemma made real, the human beings whose fate now rested in his hands. Samuel addressed the group, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "This is Joseph Crowfeather, the tracker who found us. He's been hired by Marcus Whitmore to locate the 12 who joined us recently." A murmur of fear ran through the crowd, but Samuel raised his hand for silence. He came to us openly, alone and unarmed. He could have simply reported our location and collected his payment. Instead, he's here, talking to us. I think that tells us something about the kind of man he is." An elderly woman stepped forward, her back bent with age, but her eyes still bright with intelligence. Joseph recognized her as the one he had seen teaching children to read. "What do you want from us, Mr. Crowfeather?" "I don't want anything from you," Joseph replied, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "I'm trying to figure out how to do what's right." "And what do you think is right?" asked a young man holding a small child, his voice challenging but not hostile. Joseph looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing in them the same hopes and fears that he knew in his own family. "I think what you've built here is remarkable. I think you have the right to live free, to raise your children in safety, to build something better than what you left behind." "But," prompted Samuel, sensing the hesitation in Joseph's voice, "but I also have a family, a daughter, a son-in-law, 3 grandchildren. If I don't report back to Whitmore with information about your location, they'll lose everything. They might not survive." The crowd was silent, understanding the impossible nature of his position. These people knew what it meant to have family members at risk, to face choices where any decision would result in suffering for someone you loved. Finally, the elderly woman spoke again. "What's your daughter's name?" "Sarah," Joseph replied. "Sarah Crowfeather Martinez. She married a good man, a Mexican rancher named Tom. They have a small farm about 5 miles north of here." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "And your grandchildren?" "Mary, she's 7, and the twins David and Daniel, they're 2. "The same ages as some of our children here," the woman observed. "Tell me, Mr. Crowfeather, if your grandchildren were slaves and they had the chance to escape to a place like this, what would you want someone in your position to do?" The question hit Joseph like a physical blow. He looked around at the children in the crowd, bright-eyed, curious, free to learn and grow and dream. Then he imagined his own grandchildren in chains, their spirits broken by bondage, their futures stolen before they had even begun. He thought about Mary, with her endless questions and bright smile, forced to work in the fields under the blazing sun. He imagined the twins, David and Daniel, separated from their parents and sold to different owners, never knowing the love and security that every child deserved. "I would want them to be protected," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I would want someone to choose their freedom over their own safety, even if it meant that someone's family would suffer," the woman pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. Joseph closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a mountain. When he opened them again, his voice was steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Yes." Even then, the admission seemed to release something in the crowd. Several people nodded approvingly, and Joseph could see respect growing in their eyes. They understood the magnitude of what he was saying, the sacrifice he was contemplating. Samuel stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "There might be another way." Joseph looked at him with sudden hope, grasping at any possibility that might allow him to protect both his family and the people in the village. "What do you mean?" "Whitmore expects you to find us. What if you found something else instead?" "I don't understand."